Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. This is the first in a series of 4 webinars taking place during March on the topic of offshore wind and nature. The webinars are organized by BirdLife Europe with the support of the Renewables Grid Initiative, the North Sea Foundation, and Natura Emilia. My name is Daniel Mitchell, and I'm the Marine Manager at BirdLife Europe and Central Asia. So during today's webinar, we will have a first session that will focus on setting the scene for this webinar series. We're then going to have a short break at around 11 Central European time, and this will be followed by a session focused on EU policy context for offshore wind and nature. So before we kick off the webinar, just a few housekeeping rules. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Secondly, we invite you to use your camera if possible, especially if asking a question or making an intervention during the Q&A sessions. Thirdly, please feel free to use the chat during the webinar, either to exchange with other participants or to ask questions. If there are questions that we don't have time to cover during the Q&A sessions, we'll endeavor to follow up on these after the webinar. And lastly, if you'd like to ask a question or make an intervention, please use the raise the hand button. And finally, just to say that we are recording this webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Ariel Brunner, the Regional Director of BirdLife Europe and Central Asia, to say a few words. So Ariel, over to you.
Hello, welcome to this webinar. It's really nice to see so many of you. The premise for our discussion today is the terrible ecological crisis that we are facing. I think nobody in this room needs to be convinced that the combination of climate change and the biodiversity collapse is a mortal threat to our society, and indeed to most life on Earth. In an ocean context, it's important to remember that climate change will completely devastate biodiversity in the oceans. Even just the problem of ocean acidification alone, let alone marine heat waves, loss of oxygen, alteration of currents, and so on, mean that a lot of the marine biodiversity that we care about risks simply not being there in a few decades' time. On the other hand, the more we look at the science, the more we realize that marine biodiversity is absolutely crucial for the functioning and the resilience of the ocean, including in terms of the carbon cycle. When we kill marine life, and that includes things like birds and cetaceans, we reduce the health of habitats like kelp forests or seagrass meadows, which are vital carbon stocks and carbon sinks. And there are many other interactions out there. Some of them we already know, and many of them we do not know. So just like we cannot have a healthy ocean without stopping greenhouse gas emissions, we cannot really survive the climate crisis without having a biologically healthy ocean. Now, the need to deal with those problems is of extreme urgency. On the climate side, the window of opportunity is closing very fast, and we need to decarbonize our economy as fast as we can. We really should have done it yesterday, and today is the next best. And we are facing a titanic effort there. At the same time, the state of the ocean is heavily degraded. Most of the habitats and the species are in terrible shape, and we need very quickly to protect what's left and move very swiftly into large-scale restoration. Now, there is a trade-off between those two, and we should be upfront about it. Renewable energy, offshore wind, but power lines, a lot of other things that we need to come with them, are extra human pressures on the marine environment. And they come in an ocean that is already very crowded and very damaged. On the other hand, we don't have really any choice. We cannot save ourselves and save the ocean without the very, very large-scale deployment of offshore wind. The good news is that there are possibilities of catering for both of the crises. There is a lot of improvements we can bring at sea, and there is no reason why we should not be able to build a lot of wind farms and reduce other impacts and build them in a way where we build them in the right place and in the right way and operate them in the right way. And at the end of it, and in a situation where we have more renewable energy and more life in the sea. And that's what brings us together here. It is about smart planning. It is about using best technologies and best practice. It's about taking strategic approach, and you will hear about all of that during the day. But the starting point of it is really that we need to educate ourselves. And there we need to be a little bit self-critical also in the NGO movement, but also in the industry. We still hear too much nonsense. So in my daily work, even within our own constituency, I hear people saying that wind farms are pointless and we don't really need them and they don't produce that much energy anymore and we should really just, do energy efficiency. It's not the case. The numbers just don't add up. But I also hear other people saying that, yeah, well, wind farms don't really kill birds and it's not a problem. And anyway, biodiversity will think about it when we solve the climate crisis. And again, it's not true. So we need to get serious, first of all, with ourselves about the facts and the science, what we know, what we don't know, and chart a way forward and be intellectually honest about it. And if we can be very intellectually honest within the environmental movement, and then with the industry, and if our friends from the renewable industry take the same intellectual honesty as seriously, then we can work together. And that means that we can stand up against the massive amount of disinformation that is still flowing out of the fossil fuel industry, of the people who negate the crisis and want to keep it going. And there is a lot of bad disinformation coming out, not just from the fossil fuel industry, but from some sectors of industrial fishing and by other people who are committed to the disaster as usual. I wish you a very interesting day. I hope that you will all come out of this day stimulated, maybe knowing a little bit more, certainly thinking a bit more, and that then you will be able in your countries, in your activities, to take forward this energy revolution in harmony with nature that we desperately need. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good continuation.
Thank you, Ariel, for this welcome and for reminding us of the importance of this topic. I'm now going to hand it over to Cristina Simioli, the Program Manager for Offshore Energy and Nature at the Renewables Grid Initiative, to say a few words of introduction. Cristina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So I'm following on Ariel Brunner points. We have a climate crisis and we have a biodiversity crisis. And at the moment, we are also experiencing an energy crisis. So there is an increasing level of complexity that requires solutions that cannot be found in isolation. So my name is Cristina Simioli. As Daniel said, I work for the Renewables Grid Initiative. The Renewables Grid Initiative is a unique collaboration for transmission system operators and NGOs that since 2009 have been working together under common objective, the one to allow increasing shares of renewables to be developed and recognizing the role of the grid in doing this. So therefore, NGOs and transmission system operators, which at the time and sometimes still today, sometimes can be seen as enemies, have decided to work together in order to develop a more sustainable grid with coming up with environmental and stakeholder engagement principles. I'm telling you this because what I'm presenting you today is a continuation of the spirit of RGI, where we do believe that we need holistic, interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral collaboration in order to tackle the complexity that we have ahead of us. In 2020, we established the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. The Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature is a project that brings together NGOs, environmental and climate NGOs, grid operators again, and wind industry this time, so that we have wind associations, but we have also developers, also those working in the supply chain. Now, we brought together all these actors, which today are 29, to work towards a sustainable deployment of offshore energy and grid infrastructure, so that this resonates what Ariel just said. We all recognize the need to scale up offshore developments, but at the same time, we recognize that because of a biodiversity crisis, we need to align this with nature protection and healthy marine ecosystem. Also, allow me to say that today in Europe, more than ever, we are discussing also about restoration. This is a global crisis, so it's not just in Europe, but restoration is at the center also of a discussion around the EU nature restoration law. And so this is particularly important that the infrastructure does not only reduce the impacts, but also can potentially contribute to the enhancement of the ecosystems where it is placed. Now, in terms of what we work on, so our aims. So first of all, we plan together. This is a voluntary based initiative, first of all, so that all members are voluntarily contributing to it. Our idea is that we need an integrated planning combining generation and transmission. So these two elements of generation and transmission is very important to be considered together, because without the grid, I heard someone saying sometimes, no grid, no party. Without the grid, unfortunately, we cannot make use of the electricity that is generated from the renewable plants. But at the same time, we need to integrate this planning with nature protection. The planning needs to go across borders for the entire sea basins, and this for different reasons. I mean, but if we look at this from an environmental perspective, it is of course because impacts do not recognize borders. We need to find solutions in design and engineering, because the infrastructure can actually have a positive effect that needs to be understood, learned, but there are pilot projects that we are investigating that actually are very promising on both the offshore wind infrastructure and the grid. We plan in line with marine conservation objectives. So there is a need to understand the impacts, including the cumulative impacts, because in our coalition, we look at the offshore wind transmission and nature, but of course we are aware that there are other users of the sea out there, and we need to identify mitigation measures. So this is something that is out there. We actually kind of bring together all this fragmented information and also the different perspective from the NGOs and the industry. We explore the use of sensitivity maps. We promote consistent environmental monitoring, which is key to understand the risk, but also then to identify the right mitigation measures, and then later on also to understand their effectiveness. And we aim at identifying compensatory measures designed at sea basin level. All of these has to be planned all the way through full decarbonization. We have a scarcity, and space is a scarce resource at the moment. Therefore, we do need to have an idea of the plans, not just towards 2030, but also 2040 and 2050, because space is going to be one of these problems that we need to tackle as soon as possible. And at the same time, the need to plan with the life cycle perspective. So we need from the very beginning also to consider, for instance, decommissioning. So what are we going to do with the infrastructure so after the life cycle is completed? Now, these are many of the examples that I will invite you to look at our website. So you can find different examples of activities that we have jointly done with NGOs and industry, going from very important first steps as the one of creating a common language on key environmental concepts for offshore wind energy sector, then analyzing maritime spatial planning and coming with recommendations. We have actually reacted to the EU nature restoration law, bringing together our different perspectives. We also organize webinars for for instance, on nature inclusive design, and we collect practices that are stored in our energy and nature database and that are also available in the format of videos. And last but not least, we organize events to have meaningful and engaging discussions with all stakeholders together. Now, I will just conclude this saying that the organizers of these webinars are, of course, also members of Ocean. They are part also of supported by the Velux Foundation, and so that we are very happy to have this training. This is very much needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation, Cristina, and thank you for highlighting the positive collaboration that's already going on between NGOs, transmission system operators, and the wind industry. I'm now going to give a short presentation explaining why we need both offshore wind and healthy seas. I'm going to be stressing many of the points that Ariel touched on in his introduction. So just to start with, for those that weren't here at the beginning, I'm Daniel Mitchell, and I'm the Marine Manager at BirdLife Europe and Central Asia. So to start with, as Ariel said, we are in a climate and nature emergency. I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone joining here of that. We are losing biodiversity globally across terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. And of those species of mammals, fish, reptiles, birds, and amphibians that are monitored, there's been a decline in relative abundance of 69% since 1970 on average. At the same time, global temperatures are increasing, with the past decade significantly hotter than the average since 1850, primarily as a result of human emissions of greenhouse gases and predominantly carbon dioxide from burning of fossil fuels. And taken together, the loss of nature and global warming are creating this very bleak picture that we see on the right of this slide. The nature and climate crisis is interlinked and inseparable. Changing climate is already negatively impacting habitats and species, which is in turn intensifying the effects of climate change, causing further loss of nature in a vicious spiral. Therefore, it's clear that we need to address biodiversity loss if we want to tackle climate change. And equally, we cannot tackle climate change unless we address biodiversity loss. Therefore, it's really vital that we reconcile our responses to the nature and climate emergencies. As well, to say that the loss of nature not only has big economic consequences, but also importantly is impacting on human lives and well-being. And it's the poorest and most vulnerable that will be hit first and will be hit hardest. Healthy seas provide many ecosystem services which underpin human livelihoods and well-being. So for example, they support important economic sectors like fisheries and aquaculture. They support recreational and cultural activities that are important for social well-being. And they also buffer against negative impacts of climate change in coastal areas. However, the provision of these services depend on the health of the seas. And as marine ecosystems are degraded, their ability to continue to provide these services declines, with impacts for the environment, socioeconomic impacts for coastal communities, as well as other users of the sea. So one particularly important role that healthy natural systems play is in regulating climate. So healthy marine ecosystems capture and lock away carbon, while fish and other marine species contribute to the biological pump within the ocean that transports carbon from the surface to the seabed, thus contributing to climate mitigation. However, as I said, when habitats become degraded and populations of marine species decline, they are no longer able to play this role. And this demonstrates a direct link between loss of marine biodiversity and climate change. So it's vital that we both reduce emissions through decarbonization of our energy systems and at the same time ensure that we achieve healthy marine ecosystems. Achieving one of these at the expense of the other is counterproductive in the fight against climate change. At the UNFCCC COP21 in Paris, which took place in 2015, countries agreed to keep global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit global average temperature increase to within 1.5 degrees. To do this, we need to reduce global emissions rapidly by the end of the current decade in order to reach net zero by 2050. And importantly, these emission reductions must be led by developed countries, including EU member states. And this will require rapid decarbonization of energy systems via transition to renewable energy sources. Fortunately, there are plenty of benefits from this transition to renewable energy, not least in addressing two pressing concerns that we have in Europe at the moment. The first being energy security, and in particular, reducing Europe's reliance on Russian gas. And secondly, addressing the cost of living crisis linked to soaring fossil fuel prices. At the same time, it's also really important to acknowledge that there's a moral imperative on developing countries to lead the way in emission reductions, both because their historical emissions are overwhelmingly responsible for current global warming, and secondly, because the effects of climate change, so extreme weather, temperature increases, rising sea levels, are overwhelmingly impacting countries and populations that are least responsible and have benefited least from the economic activities that have caused it. It's also important to highlight that there remains an issue of equity with per capita emissions in developed countries still significantly higher than those in the countries that have contributed least to climate change. So as I mentioned, in order to meet net zero targets, we need a rapid transition to renewable energies. And offshore wind is a proven, cost-effective and reliable renewable energy technology. And we will need to develop this at scale to deliver this shift away from fossil fuels. So while this expansion of offshore wind is vital, it's really important that it's done in ways that address its environmental impacts and also contribute to restoring nature at sea. And as Ariel mentioned, it's really important to be aware of the context in which this expansion of offshore renewable energies like offshore wind is taking place. So our seas across Europe are in a bad state due to impacts from decades of historical as well as current exploitation and human activities. And a large proportion of marine habitats and species are in a poor status, with many of them suffering from declines. And in terms of achieving healthy seas, on many aspects, we're moving away from rather than making progress towards the target. And although seas are often considered as having plenty of space, they are in fact full of economic activities, including shipping, oil and gas, fishing, and aquaculture, to name a few. Offshore wind is a relatively new player in this space and is competing for precious space with these established and other emerging human uses of the sea, and also competing for space with nature. So it's really vital that in planning activities at sea that we give nature sufficient space to thrive. And just to mention that the speed and the scale of the planned expansion of offshore wind will add significant pressure, adding to those from other human activities and marine industries, and increasing the overall pressure on marine ecosystems, which, as we have said, are already in a bad state. Therefore, in summary, it's essential that we ensure a rapid rollout of marine renewables and offshore wind. Secondly, this must be done in a way that minimizes harm to nature. However, we can't achieve healthy seas simply by improving the approach to offshore wind development in isolation. What we need is also wider action across all marine sectors to protect and restore our seas. So in this webinar series, we're going to be exploring how we can accelerate the transition to renewable energy at sea in a way that minimizes impacts on marine ecosystems. And we'll also be looking at the opportunities that the renewable energy transition provides for enhancing and restoring marine ecosystems and the potential for catalyzing the holistic management of the sea that we need in order to facilitate this renewable energy transition and to achieve healthy marine ecosystems. So that's the end of the presentation. Just to say that after the next presentation, we will have a question and answer and discussion session. But now I'm going to hand over to Mattia Cecchinato, the Senior Advisor on Offshore Wind at WindEurope, to give an industry perspective on offshore wind development in nature. So Mattia, please take the floor and share your slides.
Many thanks, Daniel, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to share my screen now. If you can just confirm that everything is okay. That's great. Good morning again, everybody. My name is Mattia Cecchinato. As Daniel said, I'm Senior Advisor for Offshore Wind at WindEurope. WindEurope is the European Trade Association for the wind energy industry. So we deal both with onshore and offshore wind, and we do represent the whole wind energy sector, from the big wind turbines manufacturers, wind farm developers, but also all the supply chain, financial and research institutes, and national associations. With my presentation, I'm going to give you an overview of the offshore wind energy sector in Europe. I'm going to give you also some technological bits and trends and the outlooks and the priorities for the sector. So these slides actually show where we stand today. So today we have 30,000 megawatts, so 30 gigawatt of offshore wind capacity installed in Europe. To give you a perspective, this represents more or less 3% of the European electricity demand. And to give you another bit for perspective, an average nuclear power plant has a capacity of 1 gigawatt. So this 30 gigawatt that we have today spans across 13 countries, those in light blue that you see in the maps, and represent around 6,000 turbines. The blue bars in the map represent the cumulative installed capacity for each country. So we see the UK currently holding the lead with almost 14 gigawatt installed, followed by Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium with the most installations, but you can see also the others, which might have few megawatt installed, either for project currently under construction or with demonstrators or pilot projects. The next slides actually show better where these developments are, as you can see, as we stand today. So all those red dots and orange dots, most of the developments today are around the North Sea, which offers very good conditions, an average water depth of 50 to 60 meters, very good wind resource. Of course, the countries facing the North Seas are well industrialized. But if you look at the green and blue dots, we see the developments are expected soon in the Baltic Sea, which offers similar conditions compared to the North Sea, but also in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic Sea basin. Offshore wind today, actually these are figures from 2020. It contributed 7.5 billion to the European GDP. In 2020, every single new offshore wind turbine that we install brings around 50 million to economy. This in terms of supply chain developments, import, exports, trade, but also direct and indirect jobs. In fact, today we have around 77,000 people directly and indirectly employed from the offshore wind energy sector, and we expect this figure to grow to at least 200,000 by 2030. But let's see maybe quickly some technological trends. So what you can see here is actually the first wind farm we ever built. It was in Denmark in the Baltic Sea. It had 11 turbines of 450 kilowatts, so half megawatt each, with a total capacity of 495 megawatts, so basically 5 megawatt. And keep this in mind because the next slide is going to show you actually the trend of the current turbines that we are installing. So you can see on the right side, the average turbine that we were installing, offshore wind turbine in 2020 was 8 megawatts, so with the capacity almost double of those 11 turbines that were installed in 1991. The trend is quite impressive. So not only the capacity is growing, so the megawatt, but also the size. As you can see, there is 8 megawatt turbine that we are installing these days, has a total height of 220 meters and a rotor blade of 164 meters. It means one single blade is 82 meters, but actually today we are already having orders. We have commercially available turbines in the size of 12, 14 megawatt, which has a rotor. The one single blade can be around 115, 120 meters, so actually longer than a football pitch. But this is not the only technological trend that is growing. So not only turbines are getting bigger, also the wind farms themselves are getting bigger. So this graph actually shows you the average wind farm size. As you can see today, the wind farms that are built are on the size of 800-900 megawatt, which is quite big. And we see also today tenders for 1 or even 1.5 gigawatt. And in fact, we end up with the currently biggest wind farm in the world is the Hornsea 2 in the UK, totaling around 1.4 gigawatt, 165 turbines of 8 megawatt each, the one we saw in the graph before. Now, the expansion of the sector, the commerce industrialization brought also the costs for building these turbines and installing these wind farms down a lot. The cost went down by 70% in the last 75% in the last 8 years. Quite impressive, of course, due to the industrialization and upscale of the sector, which is a quite big European success stories. We kickstarted the sector. We still hold the leadership both in technology and installation. And the technology is also diversified. You might have heard about bottom fixed and floating offshore wind. So the 3 turbines that you see on the left side are actually the bottom fixed, so anchored to the seabed through foundation, which could be a gravity base as the first, or monopile or jacket as the one on the right, or floating wind, which is anchored to the seabed through mooring cables, and it has a floating foundation that can be either steel or concrete. Now, floating wind, as you can see also from the figure here, allow us to go where the water depth is higher, so reaching new areas and go also farther from the coast, which has its own advantages in terms of impacts on the environment, also visual impact for coastal communities. In this map, this is a simple map of the water depth in Europe. So basically, bottom fix is suitable until 60, 70 meters maximum. So basically, everything that is red and most of what is yellow is suitable for bottom fix. All the rest, so part of what is yellow, everything that is green, light blue, and dark blue is suitable for floating wind. Floating wind is still not commercial, but it will be soon. But as you can see, there is a huge potential for this technology in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic Ocean. I also wanted maybe to quickly mention how we connect all these volumes that we are hearing. So what you can see here are actually different approaches for connecting the grid, but let's focus on the Dutch case. Every single turbine is connected among themselves and among to the offshore and to the offshore substations through the inter-array cables. So the offshore substation will gather all the capacity from the wind farms and through one landing point bring the electricity to the onshore land transformer station. Now, what you can see, the different models here is about the roles and responsibilities. So in the case of the Netherlands, the Dutch government is responsible for everything that is called the offshore grid connection. So the offshore substation, the offshore cable, and the onshore grid connection, as opposite as is in the UK, in the bottom side of this slide, where actually is the private developers thinking, having to take care about the offshore substation and the offshore connection to land. You see also in dark gray the potential HVDC station, because this is actually a newer way to connect turbines. HVDC stands for high voltage DC. This is much more suitable for wind farms that are farther from shore. So beyond the 60, 70 kilometers from shore, we see that it's more convenient, more efficient to transform the current electricity produced in AC from the wind turbines into DC and bring to shore high dense electricity. But also it allows us to interconnect. So the HVDC stations can also serve as interconnector. And this is a new way that we are exploring to connect offshore wind farms. Is what we call offshore hybrid projects. So it's we are switching from the idea of a radial connection in which one single wind farm has one single cable going to shore. But with these new offshore hybrid projects, we're thinking about clustering many offshore wind farms and through an HVDC interconnector divert the electricity to shore, but also potentially to two or more markets. This, of course, entails more efficiency on how we transmit electricity and interconnect different countries, but also means lower landing points, meaning less environmental impacts on the seabed and on the coastal areas. What you can see in these slides are the current projects under discussion. We only have one today, which is Krieger's flag, the one in red with number 1, but many others are currently under discussion. Now I'm going to present you the outlook, because there is a very important political momentum today for offshore wind, and especially governments are now putting together their ambitions. That's the case especially of the North Sea. You can see on the left side the energy ministers of the North Sea countries committing last year to 76 gigawatt by 2030 compared to the 30 we have today in all Europe. On the right side, the Baltic ministers committing to 20 gigawatts. So we see only the North Seas, Baltic and North Sea, are committing to at least 95 gigawatt by 2030. And in total for Europe, what we foresee is around 165 by 2030. You can see here the linear growth. The bars are the cumulative installations, the colors are the country. So we see UK, Germany, Denmark, and Netherlands keeping the lead in terms of installation, also by from here to 2030. But we also see new markets: France, Poland, Ireland, Portugal, and many others. But maybe there is a very important thing to note here, that the growth is 5 times what we have today, but the growth is not linear. I mean, it looks like more exponential, I would say. And this is very important to keep in mind when we think about the capacity of the supply chain. And in fact, we need to pass from the around 3 gigawatt that we install today in Europe per year. We need to raise by 6 gigawatt per year before 2025. And in the second half of the decade, we have to build more than 20 gigawatt per year in Europe. This is a tremendous increase on installation. And the first question that comes in our mind is, do we have the supply chain, the manufacturing capacity, the parts availability, and the vessels to install all these wind turbines? And the answer is no, not today. So what you can see is an overview more or less of the supply chain needs that we have and the capacity that we have today in terms of turbines. The manufacturing facilities we have in Europe can build around 7 gigawatt per year. We need more than 20 in the second half. So this means that the industry will have to heavily invest in new manufacturing facilities for turbines, but other big components as well, foundation blades and many others. We will also need vessels to install these turbines, and vessels operators are struggling due to the technological trend I showed you before. Turbines are getting bigger so fast that vessels become quickly obsolete and not able to manage those big components. And we see that we did a brief calculation last year. We need more than 20 vessels to install either cable or turbines themselves. Each vessel costs in the range of 100 million each. And the workforce, of course, it will have to step up as well. This is just a repetition of the figure I showed you before, 77,000 workers today. We need more than 200,000 by 2030. And I also mentioned ports. Let's keep in mind there's no offshore wind without ports. Ports, basically, they connect the onshore supply chain with all the maritime operations. And also this is a quite impressive figures. We will have to invest in ports 8.5 billion from here to 2030. And this is to expand current ports, create new ports and terminals in those emerging markets, create new infrastructure, manufacturing facilities, renewable hydrogen plants, and anything else that is needed for ports to support the sector. Maybe another mentioning that is worth to highlight is how all this happens in terms of project phases. So what you can see here are the various phases in the case of a centralized system. So when governments, through the maritime special planning, which we will see in a second, allocates macro areas, and progressively they will tender out sites, specific sites with this macro area. This is the leasing part. And governments, through the maritime special planning process, will have to undertake a strategic environmental assessment for these areas. Once these areas are assigned, the tender will open and all the preliminary surveys will start until we will have the appointment of the winner of the tender with the support allocation. In case there is support, the contract for difference is the most common support that government gives to projects. The final investment decisions, which is followed by the design of all the specificities of the wind farms, and then of course the installation can start. And we can see here that all the process from the leasing to the end of the installation and the grid connection can take more than 10 years. So this is very important to keep in mind, especially when considering the supply chain investments that we need, those that I mentioned before. The supply chain must be mobilized well in advance. But we've seen 2030, there's 165 gigawatt. If we proceed with the timeline, offshore wind is set to become the first electricity source in the early 2040s. And according to the European Commission, we'll need 450 gigawatt by 2050. This is including the UK and Norway, of course, but it's still a quite impressive number. Now that what you can see here is actually the split that we projected, let's say, in terms of sea basing on the right side, but also country by country on the table on the left-hand side. And of course, the first thing that pops in our mind when we see all these volumes, 450 gigawatt, is where do we place them? Do we have enough space to install at sea, to install all these turbines? But luckily, we have in our view, what is a very, very good supporting tool, which is maritime special planning. Now, what you can see here is the main principles, let's say, of how maritime special planning. In basic terms, maritime special planning is this exercise that member states must do to organize their space at sea. So they are basically telling what will happen where, so how their sea space will be used. And this is very important from the offshore wind energy perspective, because it will give us an idea of which areas will be developed. And now I have an example for you. Don't be scared about all this data. We are not going to go through them. Just focus on the right side on the map, which is the Dutch maritime special plans. And as you can see, what is important for the offshore wind sector is here are all the colored areas, which are the development areas. Now, the Dutch, of course, are one of the best examples that we have, because they not only define the areas, but they also define which areas will be developed first, so until 2030, and which areas will be developed after 2030. And this is very important, both for the offshore wind sector and for the supply chain, to get ready to build in those areas, but also for environmental reasons, because we already know which areas will be developed first, and we can start as soon as possible all the preliminary surveys and environmental assessments. But maybe what is most important also in this context about maritime spatial planning is that it's also a tool that governments use to ensure the coexistence of the various sectors at sea. And indeed, as mentioned before by Daniel, the offshore wind energy sector is the last in terms of timing, arriving at sea, and it's already finding an established balance by other economic activities and unluckily poor environmental conditions. So when we talk about coexistence with nature, of course, through the strategic and all the environmental impact assessment, there are some rigorous rules to follow in terms of prevention, so mitigation of the potential negative impacts. You can see an example in the top left slide of the bubble curtains, which is a very complicated technology to decrease the sound and vibration emissions. But it also through all these environmental assessment and maritime spatial plans, we also define what will be the compensation, but also nature enhancement measures. So you can see the oysters, the flat oyster restoration is actually a very interesting option that is being tested in the Netherlands. But we also try to coexist with the other sectors, with fishermen. For example, bottom trawling is not allowed in wind farms, but there is this trend of alternative employment. So we see many fishermen that agreeing on working with the offshore wind energy sectors, such as for guarding and patrolling the wind farm construction and operation, but also for environmental and surveys and geological and geotechnical surveys. We also aimed at coexisting with defense activities. Of course, the military also use their sea. They have their training areas, and we can do search and rescue training exercises within wind farms. We share data with the Navy. We can place defense radars in our substations, so there are also here. And we can also open the space to other activities such as aquaculture. We've seen some very interesting pilots projects for mussels and seaweed in Belgium and in the Netherlands, and we hope that this will become the norm on how we think offshore wind farms will be developed in the future. And I'm not sure how I am at time, Daniel. I just have maybe some few recommendations in the end. If I have time, I will go quickly through them.
Yeah, a couple more minutes.
Yeah, that should be more than enough. Thank you very much. And so basically the priorities for the sector are the first, it's permitting. Permitting is an issue that you might have heard WindEurope talking a lot. I must say, is mostly a problem onshore, but still offshore. We see that according to the Renewable Energy Directive, member states must define a one-stop shop, so a centralized permitting agency which will take care of all the permitting process of wind farms. The best example we have probably in Europe is the Netherlands with RVO, the Dutch enterprise agency, taking care of everything related to opening the tender, preliminary surveys, and permits. And of course, this entails the full centralization, let's say, of the site allocation and permit granting of offshore wind, but that gives an assurance both to the offshore wind sector, but also all the other stakeholders at sea, and ensure also speed and effectiveness of deployment. The second recommendation that we always bring to government is to define clear action schedules. So government should be able to tell us what is happening where. So we learned that with the maritime spatial planning process, member states allocated the areas for offshore wind developments in average from here to 2030, but they are still not telling us which areas will be developed first. We saw the example of the Netherlands, very good. We see here in this slide the example of France, even better. As you can see, France is telling us year by year what they are gonna tender, where, so which region, how much, and which technology, bottom fixed and floating. And this is such a simple exercise that we're asking governments, but it's so important for the supply chain to get ready, for ports to take their investment decisions, for environmental parties to start pre-assessing and pre-surveying the areas well in advance, but still almost none countries are doing this. So this is actually one of the things that we are louder in advocating for with member states. And we must keep in mind that offshore wind in certain cases can be built at commercial terms, so without support from the states, but many other sites, especially in developing countries, we still need some sort of revenue stabilization mechanism, because offshore wind is mostly financed through debt. So basically the project developer will have to ask a loan to a bank, and the more secure are the revenues in the long term, the cheaper will be to lend this money. But when a wind farm is set to rely only on the electricity prices, on the market prices, this financing cost can grow so much that will put at a strain the supply chain, forcing the industry to cut as much as possible to kind of compensate this highest financing cost that can raise the project cost up to almost 10%, which is quite a lot if we think that a wind farm that we build now has a raised capital of around 5 billion. And finally, the support for the supply chain. I think we discussed this quite in detail before, but again, very important to mobilize any form of possible investment well in advance. We do have European funding, but also regional and national funding. And with this, I will close it here. Well, thank you very much. So happy to reply to any question.
Thank you, Mattia. Really nice presentation and really put into perspective the challenge ahead for the offshore wind industry. So we now have an opportunity for questions and answers. So invite the audience to raise their hand if they'd like to ask a question. So we have Sinead. If I can ask you to introduce yourself before asking the question.
Yep, thanks everyone, and thanks so much for organising these sessions. It's really, really helpful. I have one question, Mattia, on your presentation. I was taking notes, unfortunately, and I got a little bit behind. You mentioned hybrid projects. I was just going to ask you what those offshore hybrid projects are. What is the hybrid element of it? Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm working with Birdwatch Ireland as Marine Policy and Advocacy Officer. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the hybrid term, in fact, refers to the dual function of the combination of wind farms and grid connection. So we are not only using the cables to evacuate the offshore wind, but we're also using those to interconnect countries. So the hybrid is indeed landing point and interconnection. This means cables will have to have a higher capacity, and there are, of course, many legal challenges that we're trying to solve, because this hybrid function of the interconnection is still not recognized in European and national laws. So it's very hard to have cost-effective projects as we stand today, but this is one of our priorities indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mattia. We now have a question from Carlos.
Hello. Hi, everybody. My name is Carlos Bravo. I work for Ocean Care. It's an international marine protection NGO. My question is related to the impact on cetaceans. So that is regarding offshore wind floating technologies. Have you studied the potential impact on cetaceans, in particular on the generation of ocean noise, underwater noise?
Yeah. So there are some studies. In general, floating wind does not need the drilling and the piling that is needed by bottom fix. That's because, as we saw, it's anchored through some mooring cable. So of course, those will have to be anchored, but we're thinking talking about completely different technical operations. So in this term, during construction, the impact of cetaceans it might be much lower. Still, as we saw the bubble curtains, there are some quite effective mitigation measures that we have to stop noise and vibration to spread. At the same time, again, floating wind is still not commercial, so we only have few pilots as we stand today, but it might have a higher impact during operation, as there is the risk for waves, especially big cetaceans, to basically snack on the cables, on the anchoring cables of the offshore wind, of the floating wind turbines. This is, well, it's predicted. Again, we still don't have, but it's very important to keep it in mind, and it will be very important to monitor this during the first commercial wind farms. In case an effect will be observed, I guess the most immediate action would be installing deterrent devices for cetacean not to get too close to the wind farms, risking to entangle in the cables.
Thank you, Mattia. And just to note that during the next webinar, which is taking place next Tuesday, we will have a whole session on impacts of offshore wind development.
Okay, thank you very much. Could you please share the study you have on this issue?
Sure, yes.
Okay. I can send you my email address through the chat, okay? Thank you.
Yes, sure.
Are there any other questions from anyone in the audience? Doesn't look like it, so we can now go for the break, almost exactly on time, and we will come back at 11:20 to restart. So I recommend everyone to just stay connected. Thank you to all the presenters from this first part. And if anyone does have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and we can follow up after the webinar, because I think Mattia will be leaving us shortly. Welcome back, everyone. We're now going to start the session on the EU policy context for offshore wind and nature. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Anouk Puymartin, who is the Marine Manager at BirdLife Europe and Central Asia, and Carla, Freund, who works for NABU, BirdLife's partner in Germany, as Policy Officer, let me get this right, for nature-friendly energy transition in Europe. So Anouk, you can share your slides and take it away.
Yes, hello everyone. Can you see it all right? Can you see everything?
We see it in presentation view.
Good. Thank you very much. So
no, we see it with the notes, Anouk, so you may need to change the screen.
All right. Wait a minute. It's weird. Okay, let me try that again. Sorry for this. Can you see it now?
Yes, now we see it.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Anouk Puymartin. I'm Policy Manager at BirdLife Europe and Central Asia. And this morning, I will, in this session, I will explore with my colleague Carla, who is also leading our policy work on energy, to give a perspective of the EU policy context for energy and nature at sea. So we've seen this morning that there is an urgent need to address climate and biodiversity crisis. The large-scale deployment of renewable energy, and especially offshore renewables through 2050, has been agreed upon and integrated into climate change and energy policy. And the need to address the impacts of this deployment has already been factored until a certain level into existing legislation and policies. We have also touched upon the fact that recent events, and in particular global geopolitical context, have impacted the existing framework and led to rapid policy changes in the EU. In particular, the war of Ukraine, and the resulting energy crisis have created an additional urgency and necessity to accelerate the process of offshore wind development. And it seems that any steps along the way could be seen also as a potential break, including measures that can be taken to avoid harmful and irreversible impacts on nature. And so that's one of the challenges we have to see today, and that's why we'll explore with you this morning the different existing legislation and policies on energy and nature, but also the challenge that the EU is facing and we are facing also as NGO, and opportunities in terms of policy and to address those challenges. So as I said, we will go through the environmental policy framework, the energy, and explore the challenge and opportunities. So first of all, I think most of you are very familiar with this, but I needed to come back to the basic. So the main pieces of EU nature legislation, the birds and habitats. So as you know, they provide a common framework in the EU that sets very high standards for protection, for nature protection across member states. So the aim of those directives is to contribute to ensuring biodiversity by conserving natural habitats and wild fauna and flora in the EU. In particular, the Habitat Directive aims to maintain habitat and species that are of EU conservation concerns or restore them to a favorable conservation status, which is defined in the directive. And the Birds Directive aims to achieve good conservation status for all naturally occurring wild bird species on territories of member states and ensures their survival on the long terms. And as you know, one of the key ways to achieve this is by maintaining and making sustainable use of this EU network of areas with high value in terms of biodiversity, which is called the Natura 2000. So all the areas that are protected under both directive form an ecological network known as Natura 2000. Also of particular interest for the development of activities and projects such as energy developments. The Article 6 is one of the most important in Habitat Directive. It defines how Natura 2000 sites are managed and protected. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but the two first paragraphs requires that within the sites, the member state should not only take appropriate conservation measures to maintain and restore habitats and species, but also avoid damaging activities that could significantly disturb these species and habitats. The two last paragraphs, the 6.3 and 6.4, lay down the procedure that member states should follow when planning new developments that might affect the sites. The first one, the first paragraph requires that any plans or project likely to have a significant impact on the sites should undergo an appropriate assessment to determine the impacts on the sites. And the authorities of the member state should not agree any plan or project that is not that is adversely affecting the integrity of the site, so it's not filling the assessment. Only in exceptional circumstances, and that's the last part of the paragraph, it's possible for a member state for a project to go ahead even with negative assessment, only if there is no alternative solutions and if it's justified by imperative reason of overriding public interest. Carla will later also mention other assessments that existing in the EU. Just to flag here that there is a specific, there are many guidance developed by the Commission on how to manage Natura 2000 sites, and there is one particularly on wind energy developments that was, I think, published in 2020. Another very important piece of legislation is MSFD, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So it's a cornerstone of EU marine environmental policy. but also at national and regional level. And it's a very reference even globally. So the MSFD was adopted in 2008. So it provides a structure for bringing together all the policies affecting the marine environment, including fisheries, energy, transport. The main objective of the MSFD, as you know, is to achieve the what we call the good environmental status of the EU marine waters by 2020. So we know that it didn't work, that it didn't reach this objective. But the directive is really important because it enshrines for the first time in a legislative framework the ecosystem approach and the ecosystem to the management of human activity and what we call the ecosystem based management. To achieve the goals, so the directive establishes different region and sub-region on the basis of geographical and environmental criteria, and also promote cooperation with member states, but also with existing regional sea conventions. And member states were supposed to develop a strategy called the Marine Strategy that breaks down the obligation in their national and regional waters. And those strategies are supposed to be updated and reviewed every 6 years. So there is a cycle of implementation. But as you know, or most of you know, it's been now more than 14 years, that the directive was adopted and the main objective was not reached. And in particular, the implementation has been too slow, principally due to limited ambition by member states to setting appropriate definition, to appropriate targets, and to take the actual measures to protect their sea. So just you to know, this piece of legislation is under review at EU level. There was the Commission started an evaluation that will be published normally this year, and it will be followed up by an impact assessment and a potential revision after 2024 with the new Commission. I wanted to mention also here one of the main, it's not a legislation, but the main strategy at the moment for biodiversity that was adopted, published in 2020, the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. So it's a long-term plan until 2030 to protect nature and reverse the degradation of ecosystem in the EU. It's one of the key pillars of the European Green Deal. It aims at the legal protection of 30% of EU seas and land and seas, and also strict protection of a third of it, so 10% of EU land and seas. Here again, the Commission has published some guidance for member states to designate additional protected areas and strictly protected areas in order to reach the targets. And the member states were supposed to submit their pledges by the 1st of March this year. Most of them didn't, but will do normally in the next months. And there will be an assessment by the Commission also, including stakeholders of the different pledges. Just to say here that, yeah, the challenge is still high because, as you know, in the seas, only 11% of the seas are legally protected compared to 26% of the land. So there is a considerable challenge also to reach the targets, but also in this 10%, only 1% can be considered as fully protected, and less than 2% have actually management plan in place. So we are very far from what is expected in the legislation, but also what is expected by this strategy is to have not only designated, but also effectively managed areas and appropriately monitored. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to already say here. And the last piece of legislation is not strictly environmental legislation, but it's very relevant for what we are talking today and in general for everything that happens at sea. The Maritime Spatial Planning Directive. So Maritime Spatial Planning is a tool that was enshrined in this directive, and that aims at analyzing and organizing existing and future human activities in marine and coastal areas, and also to identify the most suitable way of managing them and organizing them, considering not only ecological, but also economic and social dimension. So it's a public-led process with stakeholder participation, or it should be, because it's really like about bringing together multiple political objectives and different sectors. And it should aim to achieve also the good environmental status and to maintain healthy seas that are resilient, as we mentioned already, to the impacts of climate change. So it's a very useful tool to reduce conflicts between activities at sea and create also synergy between them. It should bring predictability, transparency, legal certainty, promote also cross-border cooperation between countries, and identify also opportunities for multiple uses of the space. So in the EU, the directive was adopted in 2014, so it's still a quite recent process because it required member states to adopt national maritime special plan by 2021. So most of them have done now, but still some are missing, and some of them have been also very late to submit the plans. I will talk a bit about the content later. It was just here to mention this directive and to say that it's also a very important tool to the contribution of our objective. And now I will give it over to Carla, and let me know when I should change the slide. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Anouk. So Anouk already briefly mentioned the appropriate assessments under the Birds and Habitats Directive, and I will speak briefly about the two other assessments that need to take place, which are sort of at the intersection between project development and environmental protection. And the first one I'll speak about briefly is the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, which establishes the need to do an environmental impact assessment, as the name already implies. There are certain projects which are defined in the environmental impact assessment that always need to, where it's mandatory to do an environmental impact assessment. Examples are crude oil refineries, thermal and nuclear power stations, overhead electrical power lines, dams of a certain capacity, waste disposal sites, etc. I think it's pretty obvious why these specific projects need to have an environmental impact assessment. And then there's also defined under Annex 2 of this directive, there's also specific projects that can be designated by member states to require an environmental impact assessment. And this goes through a screening procedure and a case-by-case examination. A very brief example of one of these projects would be smaller solar power sites, for example. Not every member state will require a full environmental impact assessment for a building. And then what needs to be examined in the environmental impact assessment is, for example, the impact of the project on population and human health, biodiversity, land, soil, water, air, climate, landscapes, material assets, and cultural heritage. So it's quite broad. And I think most importantly to point, these are all important aspects, but also, it has a population and human health part as well. So if we go to the next slide, to talk about the strategic environmental impact assessment, and also talk a bit about the differences between the two and how they interlink with each other, because they're complementary, but they're not the same. So it's supplementary to an environmental impact assessment. There are similarities, but one cannot replace the other. It's done at a planning stage, so it's done before there is actually a project to be developed on the ground, and it's not project specific. So it is mandatory for specific plans that include agricultural plans, forestry, fisheries, energy, which is relevant for us, industry, transport. I'm not going to read the whole list, and other plans that have been determined to require an assessment under the Habitats Directive, for example. So the EIA is way more detailed and comprehensive than an SCA. So that's the main reason why one cannot replace the other. And especially this focus on the impact on human health and, for example, also landscape. And it has so EIAs will have more of a safety and development focus. And also EIAs are done by the project developer and SCAs are done by the competent planning authority. So it's also, two different entities that carry out these plans. So that kind of rounds out the different assessments that need to be done. So I'll talk a bit about the energy policy framework in the next slide. So Anouk mentioned in the beginning of our presentation here that we're facing multiple crises. We're facing an energy crisis, and especially also through Russia's war in Ukraine, the energy policy framework has changed a little bit, or actually quite a lot over the past 2 years. So I'll talk briefly about the Council regulation, also commonly referred to as the emergency regulation, which was basically called into effect because of the war that started more than a year ago. And it's been voted on and in effect actually since the end of December 2022, and it will be in effect for 18 months. And it relates to energy from renewable energy sources, so the building of these projects, and specifically those that are designated to solve short-term energy problems. It also already includes this overriding public interest provision that I think everyone has heard a lot about. But it also specifically has not a super wide scope. It focuses mostly on solar development, repowering of projects that already exist, and heat pumps. And it also deregulates a bit from species protection. So like I said, this piece of legislation is already in effect. And the second one of interest, to the next slide, is the Renewable Energy Directive, which has been reviewed and changed many times, and I think many more times in the last year. So the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive was originally proposed under the Fit for 55 package, which was a package produced by the European Commission to make European policies Paris compatible, or compatible to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And then again, through the Russia's war in Ukraine, it was changed again to specifically increase the speed at which renewable energy projects can be developed. So looking at permitting and planning provisions specifically. And it also includes the overarching renewable energy targets. So this currently is still being negotiated, so we're not sure where it'll end up, but probably somewhere between 40 and 45% by 2030. So of our end renewable energy use, and this should be a first, like a significant step towards achieving net zero by 2050. So exactly, this piece of legislation includes the famous go-to areas, or as they're now referred to, renewable acceleration zones. And also some problematic aspects that we see is, for example, the removal of EIA requirements in these acceleration zones. And currently, I mean, there's still a lot of questions about the environmental safeguards of these renewable acceleration zones. I mean, the last trilogue meeting was yesterday, so on this specific aspect, so I'm not actually sure where we'll end up here. But specifically, it would be very important for us that these renewable acceleration zones cannot be put in Natura 2000 sites in protected or otherwise sensitive areas, because you're removing some of the environmental impact assessment requirements. And it's a bit farther reaching than the council regulation, because it covers a wider range of different projects. And in our opinion, it creates some legal bottlenecks because of deregulating from already existing legislation, which Anouk presented earlier. And for us, it's highly likely that this will create a lot of disputes in the court. So, I mean, we'll have to see how this actually turns out, but this is something we would like to highlight as a potential problem. Yeah, if you can go to the next slide. So we're going to go through a few slides of what we see as challenges. So I think we've kind of indicated this a few times, that despite existing EU legislations for climate biodiversity, the energy targets are still too low to actually achieve our climate objectives and be Paris compatible. So even the Fit for 55 package is not actually compatible with our trajectory to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. And biodiversity is in a bad state, and good environmental status is not achieved in any of the areas we're talking about, whether it's marine, terrestrial, or freshwater environments. On the right, you see the Living Planet Index of the WWF, the most recent report, and it shows a decrease of the Global Living Planet Index by 69% up to 2018. So that's quite a significant increase, and something that we'll have to tackle. And again, highlighting, we're facing two crises, and they very much are the same side of the one coin, or two sides of the same coin, two sides of the same coin. So if you can go to the next slide. And yeah, I already said what is on the next slide. So they're all interlinked crises. You could add the energy crisis in here, somewhere. It's a slide from, it's a very famous meme from when we were facing COVID-19. So exactly, climate and biodiversity crises are connected and need to be addressed together. And nature protection and the energy transition cannot be enemies. It doesn't serve our purpose, and it won't help us achieve a sustainable future. I think the next slide's Anouk will cover.
Thank you very much, Carla. So yeah, I will take over from here. So one of the challenge that was already mentioned when I talked about marine spatial planning, and it was already largely mentioned this morning, but it's a high competition between users of the sea. So it's not only a challenge in terms of space and in terms of like pressure and ecological carrying capacity of the sea, but also in terms of policy, because we have different sectors that are governed and responding to different legislation and different policy processes. And we really see a lack of coherence between all of these, between the different objectives, but also between the way it's implemented. So that's, let's say, I think one of the main challenge, and we have some tools, and we will mention it later to address this. But so the challenge is really how to balance the use of the sea, to make coherent the different policies that are an objective in general, like the biodiversity, energy target at the same time, but also to address the competition concretely, harmonize activity with the available space that might require also like changing some current use of the space, and also everything should be, of course, in terms of ecological carrying capacity of the sea, because that's something that is not possible to change with the policy. Another challenge that is in front of us, and that's really something we see in our current discussion with industry and the TSOs in the Ocean Coalition, is this question of, oh, sorry, I was too fast, is this question of that solutions for nature are complex. There are many different kind of impacts on species and habitats, and that require very different kind of intervention. There is no one fit all solution, unfortunately, and that requires not only different scientific or technical intervention, but also from various policies and stakeholders. So that doesn't make the things easier. So from the planning to the decommissioning of the offshore energy, there are many different policies involved. So the challenge here is also about renewable energy infrastructure should be locally developed and managed in a way that is not only financially viable, but also technically feasible, but also ecologically viable. I think on the next slides, we go to more positive opportunities, but over to you, Carla, for starting with this.
Yeah, so it's not all challenges. Of course, with some challenges, there are also a lot of opportunities. So, I mean, although we haven't achieved a lot of the targets that we've set, there is a momentum for climate and biodiversity. So you can see that in the different examples that we listed below. UNFCCC COP27, while it didn't bring the results that we hoped, biodiversity is getting more and more recognition in these discussions as well. And I mean, we are making small steps in the right direction. And then, I mean, the big monumentous thing that happened this year was the CBD COP15 with the Global Deal for Nature, which was a really impressive feat. And then also over the past 5 years of this commission, climate and biodiversity has gotten the biggest recognition it ever has with the EU Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy, and then also increasing, as we already mentioned, increasing renewable energy targets and the increased just overall commitment to speeding up the energy transition. So if you go to the next slide. And then concretely, the national energy and climate plans are being reworked currently and need to be presented by the end of June. So this will be important because it's going from the theory of having just specific, just general targets and goals to practical plans on the ground in member states on how they're going to achieve these targets. But we have to highlight that the previous plans were not adequate for reaching 2030 targets. So those were from, I think, 2019. And on the right side, you can, on the left side, you can see a figure done by Climact and Ecologic when they evaluated the last plans. According to their target adequacy, how credible the policies were that they put in place. So whether or not they had vague or incomplete policy measures, and if they highlighted investment needs and the needs for financing, and then how much they included public engagement, which is something we highlight as very key for a just transition, because you need to have everyone on board. And as you can see, the highest grade that any member state received was 50. It was a C, with only getting 52% of the targets that they set out in this report. And also we need to highlight that the current NACPs are not demonstrating a commitment to restoring the natural carbon sinks and using nature-based solutions as a key tool for climate mitigation and adaptation, which is something that would be very important in addressing both climate and biodiversity crisis. So we'll have to see what these new plans bring. And also, take that with you as when you're engaging with your national stakeholders or your governments, that this will be a big signal to see how seriously we're taking the new targets and goals overall.
Thanks, Carla. I will take over again. So on the, it was already mentioned many times, but it's really like one of the big policy opportunity is the marine special planning process, because that's a directive, and there is at the EU level, and there was a process of having plans adopted by 2021, what I mentioned before, but it's a learning process, and it will be subject also to implementation of the marine special plan, but also review. So we really see there an opportunity to ensure the coherent spatial and temporal distribution of human activities at sea to achieve the ecological and energy targets at the same time. So in our view, it should the MSP process and the implementation of the plans and the review later, and that's something we are really engaging a lot, because we think it should aim to ensure that a robust and strategic evidence base to inform the setting of the activities, and including the offshore renewables, but also it helps also providing the certainty that everyone needs. We all heard Mattia this morning about the challenging for the industry also, but also to enable effective mitigation and compensation also, and every measure that will need to be taken at all the steps of the process for nature, for protecting nature. So we think it's a crucial process to coordinate the delivery of wind targets, while assessing and managing ecological impact at a sufficient scale also, that for taking into account cumulative impacts on nature and the ecological carrying capacity of it. So we just for information, we have published last year assessment of different marine special plans, and also including recommendation for the future. But I know that WWF also has done a lot of work on it, so you can find all information on our website if you want to know more. Another big opportunity for us is, as most of you must be aware, the new the new proposal for restoring nature at EU level. So it's a proposal of legislation that is bringing in the EU a very new positive conservation agenda. So it's a regulation proposal. For the moment, it's still under discussion in the Parliament and the Council, but it sets overarching restoration targets, namely an effective and area-based restoration measures on 20% EU land and sea by 2030, and on all ecosystem in restoration need by 2050. And it includes also obligation of non-deterioration. So I don't want to enter too much in detail of this, because it's subject to a lot of changing, because it's under a legislative process right now. But for us, it's like a very huge opportunity, because member states will have, that keeps very strong and binding process to restore nature, and also because member states will have to develop national restoration plan. So in the environment, there is actually a specific challenge for restoration measures, because it will be subject to existing policies, such as the common fisheries policy. So that means that any restoration in the marine area that will require restricting fishing practices will need to be adopted through fisheries rules. So that's something, for example, that we are trying to change we are trying to influence for change in the legislative process, because I think it's really that will really limit the implementation of the restoration measures in the marine environment. But marine restoration can take different forms. So you might be aware there is like this all passive and active restoration idea. So the passive restoration means the natural recovery by limiting pressures, so that will require to restrict existing activities or current harmful activities. And there is also a possibility of active restoration measures, so the manipulation of ecosystem and species, aiming at their recovery. So here it can include from eradication or control of invasive to establishing artificial reefs, or restoration of seagrass, oyster bed. So many things that can contribute at the same time to achieve more biodiversity, but also as a climate target, because by targeting carbon-rich ecosystem also. So we see this also as a very important a very good, very important opportunity, because as we mentioned before, the Repower was given priority in the last months to accelerate offshore renewables, and we call for this process to be given the same level of ambition, to be adopted quickly and to be implemented at the same time and hand in hand at national and regional level, to make it coherent between achieving both targets at the same time. A last slide before we close this session. It's a bit like kind of a conclusion of everything what was said before. So we say we are also at a crossroad for nature and climate. So we try to address both at the same time. So either we keep doing things the same way, and we know that it's not working neither for nature, for biodiversity, and for climate, or we take the momentum that is here in front of us to take the opportunity to make a real change for nature and climate. So the idea of this nature positive and energy transition at sea is based on an existing concept of nature positive that is a global concept that you might be aware, that is about stopping the degradation of biodiversity and going to a positive direction of full recovery by 2050, and that should be starting actually by the end of the decade. So we see that nature positive is a catalyst for change, and that nature positive energy transition is an opportunity for offshore wind to be this driver for change in the sea. So to avoid that energy transition contribute to further loss of nature, we need at the same time, as I mentioned before, to restore and enhance nature and marine ecosystem with the same ambition. And we need for this to empower the stakeholders to be the driver for change with the governments, but also to think about restoration beyond the project level, because for the moment when we talk about compensating nature loss, it's often reduced to a project level solution, and we see that with the scale up of the rollout and the scale of the deployment that will happen, we need to find really more ecologically meaningful solution for both nature and climate. So it will also requires to remove and to reduce all existing pressure to support the transition of other sectors, including fisheries, which is really one of the most harmful sector for the marine biodiversity at the practices for the biodiversity at the moment. And so everything will be for us a prerequisite to the expansion of renewables energy, and has to be taken at the same time, following an holistic ecosystem-based approach. So that's really something I wanted to finish our presentation with, and maybe to start a discussion, but just to tell you that everything that all the topics that we covered today will be also explored in more detail during the next sessions. Thank you very much for your attention, and let us know if you have any specific question. Thank you.
Thank you, Anouk and Carla. Very interesting and comprehensive presentation. So we now have a session for question and answers and discussions. So if you have a question or would like to make an intervention, please raise your hand. And Anouk, maybe you can stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, I was looking for that. Sorry.
Thanks. Maybe while we wait for questions from the audience, I can ask a first question to you and Carla. So it's whether you feel the current and proposed policy framework is sufficient to deliver the transition to renewable energies that we need at the pace that we need it, but also deliver in terms of nature. And if not, what do we need to do this?
I can start if you want. Yeah. I think I already highlighted this a little bit in my talk, especially considering the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive and the emergency regulation. I think from our perspective, it tackled it really more pitted the two crises against each other than it really did try and tackle create sort of a nature-friendly energy transition. By really seeing all the bottlenecks as nature protection and deregulating from existing laws. I think it can or has the potential to create a really problematic scenario in the coming years, especially looking at a top-down approach to energy transition and not looking into bringing people along and really being inclusive in that manner. So I think the quick answer to your question is no, I don't think it does. There are some attempts at tackling some of the bottlenecks where we really see it, which would be sort of missing expertise in member states, not enough capacities in the authorities that are responsible for permitting and planning. Those are just two examples, sort of EI procedures that were done poorly and where you had to wait too long for an authority to get back to you on them and then redo things and those kinds of things. And that's something, for example, data sharing would help if we had more information on environmental impacts in a specific place, then you could be faster at assessing what the impacts would be. So, I mean, maybe I'm going on a bit too long, but that would be sort of my short answer, no. And we're trying very hard to tackle where we actually see the bottlenecks in the energy transition issue.
Thanks, Carla. Anouk, anything to add?
I'm sharing the same feeling, in particular when you see when you see the attention that is given in the energy policies to accelerate the process in terms of deregulating, it's not giving us, a feeling of trust. And in particular, when you also see, because we try to put on the same levels nature restoration law, for example, with this, but we see that it faces a lot of resistance. So like restoring nature is really facing like a strong resistance today at a political level. And while it is necessary that these things are done together, what we try to highlight earlier during our presentation.
Thank you, Anouk. We now have a question from David Howe.
Hi everybody. I see I haven't put my label on. So many of you will know me from BirdLife, but since just a few days ago, I've joined BirdLife, the team that's organised this session from BirdLife, the BirdLife Europe and Central Asia team working on energy and especially on offshore energy questions. But I've come into this from a climate and energy background, and I think there's maybe I could just make one observation and then put a question to all of us, but especially to Anouk and Carla. Sadly, right around the world, we've woken up far too late to the need to act on the climate crisis and the need to act on the biodiversity crisis. And what we're seeing is, I think the global community and the EU is no exception, reacting faster to the climate crisis than it is to the biodiversity crisis. It's still not reacting fast enough to the climate crisis, and it's reacting even more slowly to the biodiversity crisis. So we're in this terrible game of catch-up where it's very difficult to do things well. Doing things well often needs time, and that's one thing we don't have. We're in for a very bumpy ride, and that's even more of a reason for us to be talking to all of the actors involved in trying to push this forward. But I think it's really noticeable how here we are talking about massive new sector being deployed in the sea. And that's got massive political backing, but we don't see that at the same degree of political backing for the massive effort that's needed on biodiversity conservation and restoration. So I think that's as one general observation I would make is it's not unique to the EU, it's a global question, but I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of that, and that we those of us coming from the biodiversity world, that we really stick to our principles, and we push hard for biodiversity to be given the chance, biodiversity action to be given the chance to catch up with climate action. And then secondly, the specific question, I was really struck by the earlier slides on the need for port infrastructure to support these very, very big new installations going out offshore. And my question is whether in the development of the sector so far, where we already have a mature sector, whether there have been important biodiversity issues that have arisen from port expansion and extra marine traffic associated with these big installations, or whether really nothing there's been no problem, or there have been some but they've been resolved. And any experience on that could be shared with the group online here today. Thanks.
I can give an attempt. I mean, just so I previously worked a lot on the Water Framework Directive, and the Water Framework Directive in terms of like chemical pollution, it still covers the first part of the marine environment. And I know that, I mean, shipping traffic is a huge source of marine pollution in that sense. So I would imagine that if you're increasing port and its capacity, that you would be creating a problem on that aspect. And also, I mean, again, it's a space issue. No, I mean, the size of these things are quite large. The coast is used by many different users, so it's, I think, another thing where you're gonna have to expect conflict in terms of space and use, and all the other negative aspects that come with just increased traffic in a certain area. But again, I mean, I haven't worked on this specifically. That would just be in my imagination, but I mean, it's another thing that we'll have to solve. I mean, we need the energy transition, and WindEurope really highlighted sort of our current capacities and where they're limited. And so this is something that we'll definitely have to tackle and work on. And I'm sure there's ways to create more sustainable shipping, etc. So maybe Anouk is shaking her head, so she wants to say something.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely not an expert on port policies, but I just want to say that's a bit what I tried to say also during the presentation, is that it's also an opportunity to transition the current sectors and activities, and shipping, I think, is part of it. Fisheries is clearly something we are really focusing on because it's one of the let's say, most important activities at sea in terms of the impact it has, but shipping has, or definitely is. And like, I've seen some very interesting projects, I think in the UK, with companies working together also on the having like electric vessels for the transfer. So I think there are very much opportunities for not only trying to reorganize and reduce current activity, because we need to, I mean, because there won't be place for doing everything at the same time, if we consider that life has a limit to let's say to absorb everything, but also in terms of transitioning the different sectors, and that's where we really believe that as a new sector, it's not about taking the whole responsibility of the situation, but that the wind industry can play a key role in this, supporting the transition of other sector, because that's something that, as an NGO, we are asking for, but we can't be something that we are driving alone, and that's something that the industry and the member states and all the stakeholders should be driving together. And as you say, David, it's about also talking a lot to each other and finding a way of working together.
Thanks, Anouk and Carla. Maybe I can just add in terms of kind of above water impacts of marine traffic linked to offshore wind farms. We will cover this in the next webinar where we look at impacts, but it is known that this traffic does have impacts on birds, and it's important to consider this along with the impacts that the actual turbines have. So, are there any other questions from the audience? I see a question in the chat that's asking about monitoring systems for detecting collisions. So we don't have a dedicated session on that during the webinars. We will touch on it when we talk about impacts, but we won't go into all of kind of the technical aspects of it and what the benefits or challenges of the different technologies are. So we have a question from Dominic. Please go ahead.
From NABU, and I would like to know what kind of potential do you see on tackling climate and biodiversity goals on a transnational, rather basin-wide scale from an EU perspective?
I can again start. I personally see huge potential in sort of a transnational approach. I think if you look at the sea space as an entire ecosystem, and also it frees up space because there's obviously different energy needs per country, and also different sizes of sea area that belongs to each country. So if we had a regional transnational approach, I think that would really help. But I also understand that the current political climate is that everyone wants to cover their own energy needs and wants to make sure that they can sufficiently power their own country and within their own boundaries, just given the political climate we are in and the energy crisis we have. So it's also a little bit of a more difficult discussion, but I think there's huge opportunities in creating a more trans-boundary approach to energy needs. I hope that answers your question specifically.
Thanks, Carla. Any more questions or interventions from the audience? If not, maybe I can close by reminding that we will have the second webinar in this series next Tuesday at the same time, so starting at 10 Central European time. And as I mentioned, we will have a session on potential impacts of offshore wind developments, covering both ecological impacts, but also the social acceptability of offshore wind and the socio-economic impacts. And then we will be looking at avoiding and mitigating impacts from offshore wind developments. So we'll have a look at the application of the mitigation hierarchy to offshore wind developments. We'll talk about offshore wind development in the context of maritime spatial planning. And then we will be looking at wildlife sensitivity mapping as a tool that can be used to inform the spatial planning of offshore wind developments. And we'll have a case study of how this is being used in Germany. So I finish by saying thank you to everyone for joining us. Have a nice rest of the day, and we hope to see you again next Tuesday for the second webinar.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Gracias, adiós.